I'm really thrilled to be joined by Bruce Daisley. He is the host of Top of Business podcast, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. He was Twitter's vice president, and before that, he ran YouTube UK at Google. So when he talks about the workplace, well, he knows what he is talking about. And indeed, he has put many of his thoughts down on paper, writing the best-selling books, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat, The Joy of Work, and an upcoming book by the name of Fortitude, set for release a little later on this year. Bruce, you have said you're on a mission to change the world of work. Some of that has happened as a result of the pandemic, the elephant in the room. And I'm really interested to find out your thoughts on the effect the pandemic has had on the world of work over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think we've witnessed, thank you so much for having me as well. I think we've witnessed in the last 2 years an unbundling of the office. So the office used to be this place that you went to do so many different parts of work. Over the last few years, we'd already witnessed, most of us were working hybrid already because, we were doing emails on our phone or on the dart, or we were just, we were having to sort of adapt to working away from our workplace. But what's happened in the last 2 years is it's forced us to fully reconcile ourselves to it. And this really fascinating research by a guy at Stanford University called Nick Bloom. He's probably the world's leading expert on remote working, hybrid working research. And he looked at employers, he looked at firms, how many days they expected their workers to be working from home. And at the start of the pandemic, people had already worked out that this hybrid experience was coming our way. And most employers said that they expected workers to be working from home 1 day a week. Now, the latest figures suggest that that's already at 2.2 days a week. So we're moving in the direction where not only have we seen an unbundling of what the office used to be, but also a recognition amongst employers that something has fundamentally changed and it's non-negotiable, really.
Has there been a correlation? I know you've had Nick Bloom on your podcast recently. Has there been a correlation between people who prefer to work remotely and their dislike of the work environment, or indeed their jobs?
Yeah, I mean, we do witness some of that. So actually younger female workers and workers from ethnic minorities have expressed a greater willingness to stay working remotely. And when they're asked, younger female workers say that they are against their wishes, they are sexualized by male colleagues and they just don't want to be exposed to that. Or young workers from ethnic minorities say that they often encounter sort of microaggressions and comments from colleagues that working remotely they were spared from. So we've definitely witnessed that the experience hasn't been evenly distributed. And I think there's a really critical element of that. I did some work for an organization in Australia, and we were looking in Australia because there's so much data published there on gender in organizations. So you have to publish your gender split at every level of your organization. And so what we were able to do was demonstrate that organizations that were very male skewed were far more likely to insist on a 5-day-a-week return to the office or a 4-day-a-week return to the office than those that had more gender parity. So it's a really interesting perspective. While this might seem a very simple, straightforward question of where we park our laptop, where we're going to do our work, there does seem to be an element of diversity and inclusion at the heart of it. Really critical, I think, for any of us. If we're sitting there thinking work isn't like the good old days, we should ask ourselves a little bit, to what extent was work the good old days, and whether that was partly based on our own perspective.
What about, again, going back to the pandemic and its influences, the Great Resignation? What are your thoughts on people's desire really to drop everything and decide, right, no, I'm going to take this opportunity now, this sea change, this cultural sea change of the Great Resignation, which is happening all around us at the moment?
Remember that first time that your mum and dad left you alone and in the house, and you felt like you'd earned the responsibility because they came back home and the house hadn't burnt down? And that's what we've just seen. We've just demonstrated most organizations have just had a good couple of years of results, or they've actually kept the lights on in the most remarkable adversity. And now mom and dad have come home and said, you're never going to be allowed to be on your own again. And it just feels like, hang on, I earned something here. We passed through a threshold where actually I was being treated like a capable, responsible adult. And I think that's the challenge of a lot of organizations right now. I was at a conference last week where there was a lot of management consultants and investment bankers. And one of the gentlemen said to me, what you don't understand is we need to be in the office 5 days a week to do our jobs. Well, the challenge is that anyone who would hold that conceit, would try and peddle that as an argument, has just got 2 years of evidence saying that's not necessarily the case. So I think the challenge at the moment right now is that a lot of workers are saying, look, I recognize that there might be some things that you expect from me, but don't sell me a version of work, a Disneyland model of the office, where there's going to be loads of ideas exchanged at the water cooler. There's going to be loads of team rapport being built. And yet when I turn up to the office, I find that I'm on back-to-back video calls and sitting waving dispassionately at my colleagues as they wander past. So I think the way that we've sold a version of the workplace right now, because it's not necessarily coinciding with the way that people are experiencing work, they're seeing some dissonance, and the great resignation comes from that, and it's permeating all organizations. We're seeing some of the biggest missteps are amongst technology companies, and technology companies like Apple and Google have mandated a big return to the office, and have seen big pushback from their employees. Last week, Apple saw the head of their machine learning, of their artificial intelligence part of their business, resign, saying he was not happy with their return to work policies. So I think we're seeing a really interesting change. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there's work by a professor called Raj Chowdhury at Harvard Business School. And he says every time in the past, working conditions have changed. And that might have been in the past that workers demanded laptops rather than desktop computers, or workers demanded a degree more flexibility, or the ability to access their email on their phones. It's always been led by the top talent. It's always been led by workers who believe that they've got some capital. They've been able to renegotiate the terms. And he says, Raj Chowdhury says, right now, top talent is demanding work from anywhere. Wow. Now, whether this happens or not, I don't know, but it gives you a really strong indication. If any of us are fighting a war at the moment about we want our workers back in the office 5 days a week, it could well be before we know it, we're on we're fighting a defensive battle of trying to keep the talent that we've got at all. So, it's really interesting. I think being led by the data is helping us to understand one fundamental thing. It's a time for experimentation. No one's got any of the answers. Witness the biggest companies in the world, the most resourced companies in the world haven't got the answers on this. And so it's a time for a degree of humility, a time for listening, a time for us to work out what comes next by experimenting.
It's interesting because I've actually heard anecdotal evidence of people who are going into the job market, and one of those bonuses now that they're looking for is the ability to work at least for a portion of the week remotely. On that subject of people going into the job market, if somebody's considering changing careers now or leaving their job, what advice would you have for them, given how everything is so in flux at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a time where, for the first time, these questions are being posed, and I think it's very fair for you to ask how what the policies of the organization are, how those decisions are reached about what the policies are, and what they look like going forwards. I think there's a good deal of evidence suggesting that when we're given more flexibility, we regard it as important as salary. So, some of the firms that have tried to demand workers back in the office have found that they've had to pay a significant price premium. Looks like it's between 20 and 30% extra salary to be in the office all the week. So and the reason why, when we delve into the data of why working from home is popular, it's not a productivity thing. It's not necessarily an autonomy thing. It's generally because it spares us about an hour and a bit for a commute. So, if we find our time getting ready in the morning and then commuting, we find that loss of time is generally about an hour and a half. And in aggregate, those two things, it's a little bit longer for women than it is for men getting ready. They generally spend about 10, 15 minutes longer getting ready. But if we look at those things, that time saving is what people are quibbling about. So over in the UK, we've had business dinosaur Lord Sugar, has been out this week saying that anyone who doesn't want to return to the office is a lazy git, he styled them as. And so, I think the challenge is people who say that are missing the fact that on average, the average worker over the course of the last 2 years has worked, according to Microsoft Teams data, has worked an additional 45 minutes a day. So they're not necessarily lazy gits. They just don't want to lose an hour and a half being on public transport or lost in sort of an endless traffic jam navigating the outskirts of the city. So, I think we've got to be honest. This is a discussion about freeing people from some of the taxation that used to exist around our jobs, getting to the office.
A couple of years ago, I read a really good book. I don't know if you've read it, Deep Work by Cal Newport. And he talks about us having a limited reserve of concentration. And I saw that you mentioned the same thing when you were in conversation with Stephen Bartlett on his podcast, Diary of a CEO. With that knowledge in mind about limited reserves of concentration, how can we use this to our favor, especially when we're working remotely and in the office and we have that hybrid working system at the moment?
Yeah, I think this is a fundamental understanding. My favorite quotation on it is by a guy called Daniel Levitin. And he says, with regards to that science, he says, quote, our brains are configured to make a certain number of decisions per day. And once we reach that limit, we're unable to make any more, regardless of how important they are. Now, that's a really fundamental thing, because that suggests that our attention, our brain power, is far more like the battery on our phone than we like to pretend. We like to pretend that unlike our phone, we can be on the screen nonstop all day, leave the house on the screen all day, and we won't hit a battery problem at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. In fact, the evidence suggests that our brains are far more like the phones. Now, as soon as you recognize that, you think, wow, putting workers through endless 20 hours a week of Zoom calls might actually be preventing them from doing our jobs. And the unfortunate thing about work is we never have that decision of scarcity. We never say, okay, if I do this, then I can't do this. If I spend time doing this, then I'm going to be less effective doing that. And so actually seeing work and the amount of work we're able to do as finite forces us to make some decisions. Look, I was in a direct issue of this. I worked in Twitter. I was London Twitter office. We had people resigning with no job to go to. We had like massive attrition, as we called it. And, one of the things we had to sit down and chat to some of our colleagues about why they were leaving, what was precipitating it. And they were saying, look, I'm just completely spent. I'm exhausted. I'm on back-to-back calls. I'm in endless meetings. And the moment I end the call, I have to go out and plow my way through an inbox and a Slack message board. And so as a consequence of that, we're completely overwhelmed. And so we made the decision, right, what could we do to halve the amount of time our employees, our colleagues, our workers spent in meetings? And it's a really difficult thing. It starts forcing you to do things, because simultaneously, most of us would say that meeting could have been an email. That meeting didn't need to happen. Blimey, he dragged that out for an hour. We recognize that. However, when it comes to our own meetings, we're like, this is a really important one. We need the full hour. So, we've sort of got this myopia. We've got this partial perspective that we're never really honest with each other. And I think that's the challenge of modern work. We're not honest about, excuse me, we're not honest about the challenges, and we're not honest about the inputs and the outputs.
Well, you mentioned there about needless meetings, and I noticed in your writing that makes up one of the many hacks that you talk about in order to make the work environment more joyful, cutting back on meetings and having things like walking meetings. Can you tell us a little bit more about how we can make our workplace more enjoyable and more joyful?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, it comes down to, I often get asked a question by organizations, and they say, we've got burnout. How can we deal with burnout? We sent people on a webinar about burnout, and they're not dealing with it. It fundamentally comes down to we're trying to do too much, and we're not making decisions of scarcity. We're not making decisions. What should we stop doing? And that fundamentally is what it comes down to. Imagine if you or I were asked to look over the training regimes of Olympic athletes, and we looked and we said, this athlete was training 70 hours a week or 60 hours a week, and they were getting up early and they were trying to squeeze in an extra run. We'd look at it and go, and they were underperforming. We'd look at it and go, I think I know what the problem is here. They're doing too much. If they focused, if they tried to cut out some of the stuff that was extraneous and unnecessary, they'd probably be more effective. And yet, when it comes to applying that same critical eye at our own work, we hesitate from doing it. We hesitate from saying, wow, that weekly 2-hour meeting feels a bit excessive, or we've just got too many people on these calls where, people haven't spoken for 6 weeks on some of these calls. We never go through that same rigor. And so, first thing I'll say to anyone, if they're trying to mitigate the effects of burnout, of exhaustion, is look, what can you get rid of? What can you reduce your time spent? However, once you've done that, there are things that seem to alleviate it. Going for a walking meeting seems to enhance things. Turning something from a video call into a phone call seems to be enriching for people in terms of it tends to increase their energy levels rather than reduce them. So trying to balance how we do things, I think is really important. So one of the things that I saw was that I chatted to a leading expert about meetings, and he said one of the things you can do is replace one of your meetings with magic time. And magic time is it just involves keeping the time on the calendar. Normally, most of our meetings are in place because we want to make sure that if we need to speak to each other, we're going to get opportunity to speak this week. And so then we just fill that slot with an agenda. We fill it with loads of action points. We create work about work because of that meeting. Whereas if you alternatively, you say, okay, this team, we have a magic hour every Tuesday at 3. That means we are always available for each other at Tuesday at 3. We can even work together if you want, at that time. But it just means if I need to chat to you, I know that we've got a time scheduled for it during the week. But you don't create an agenda about it. You let people get their work done. So that can be one of the ways that you try to mitigate the impact of this.
How can we impress upon, let's say, our bosses and our management of the need to think laterally, the need to take on some of these approaches that you're talking about now? Because very often in work environments, well, what the boss says and what management says goes. And if they're stuck in the past and they are intransigent, well, then it's a block then to any progress that we can make. And then it further accelerates our drive to leave that particular company or that job.
Absolutely. Data is the answer. I remember reading a book by a couple of writers about work about 10 years ago. And it had loads of opinions, ASAP is toxic, or this. And I thought, this is great. All of this is great, but because there's no evidence in it. If I turn up to my boss and I say, I want to change the culture with these 3 opinions, he'd say, okay, well, I've got opinions too, and I'm more senior. So we probably need to find ourselves in a situation where we're giving some good evidence. So when we were trying to change things at Twitter, one of the things we had evidence that a whole load of people were quitting, and they were mentioning the workload as one of the reasons why they were quitting. So we had evidence that, okay, if we do nothing, things might continue as bad as they are or could conceivably get worse. So it gave us a data point. And so then you can say, right, I always find away days, offsites are a good place to bring these discussions up. Quite often in the run up to an offsite or an away day, someone's looking for an agenda item. You can say, okay, I've got this article. Good article to share right now is that there's really good research that came out a couple of weeks ago about having one day a week that's meeting free seems to be really enriching. So what would a meeting-free day look like? Well, this article, you can distribute it to your team. 70 companies that tried this, all with at least 1,000 employees, so they weren't tiny firms. They tried this out, and they reported that workplace engagement went up, productivity went up, and burnout went down. Right, so what would it look like? Well, how about we introduce Wednesday as a meeting-free day? And what that means is you can self-organize a conversation, a coffee, a chat with someone, but there's no standing meetings allowed on Wednesday. Right. Immediately, you've got an experiment that's based on data that you can measure the impact of it afterwards. Now, I think that spirit of experimentation is really critical component of what any organization should be tackling right now. Now, an organization committing to no meetings on Wednesday sounds fearful. An organization committing to 3-month experiment of no meetings on Wednesday Sounds doable, right? Okay, well, we'll give it a go. And actually, some of that's going to be into the summer season. Actually, that feels doable. Then at the end of 3 months, you've got a point where you go, okay, here's how it worked. Here's how it really didn't work. What could we do to change it? And so that sense of experimentation, there's a critical thing right now. If you ask most people about hybrid working, is that we're in a place where hybrid working is proving dissatisfying to a lot of people. We've gone through two changes. Everyone was in the office. That kind of worked, where occasionally there was someone on a big screen out dialing in from somewhere. Then we went to everyone being remote. That kind of worked because everyone was there was some equity, some equality, that everyone was a screen. Now we've gone to this situation where I've just journeyed into the office. It took me 45 minutes to get in. I spent, 10 euros on a coffee and a croissant. I sit down at my desk and I'm doing video calls with people who are dialing in from home. I'm like, oh man, I could have saved that money. I could have saved that time. Why am I here? And there's a big question that one research organization called Leesman talk about. They say, we've got to articulate what the workplace why is. Explain to our colleagues, explain to our team members, why are we coming into the office? And if you're coming into the office because the boss wants you to do your Zoom calls from the office 3 days a week, you're going to fail, because there's no upside to that. You're basically just putting an obstacle course in front of people, saying your job is a little bit more complicated. And as a result of that, no doubt in 6 months' time, people are going to be like, you know what, it was too much faff. I was making a journey in. I can't understand why I was being forced to go in. No one spoke to me all day. I didn't see anyone. Now, if we say, right, here's what we're doing. I saw one organization that said our culture is now, the experiment we're doing is Wednesday plus one. Right. Why? Wednesday is, maybe you could do it meeting free on Wednesday. It's like the brotherhood of man. Everyone's there. Anyone you want to see. It's like the good old days. It's a bit of a jamboree, it's Marrakesh market of like interactions. Plus one, we don't want the office to be completely dead the rest of the week. We'd love it. Maybe you pick your team all comes in on a Tuesday, or your team all comes in on a Friday, whatever it is. Wednesday plus one is our culture. Great. There feels like a decision there that benefits from the network effect that the office creates. When we're all around each other, it helps us create those water cooler moments, create those interactions. But we're not having this binary system that you've got to be in 3 days a week, but no one ever sees you. It's trying to create something that feels sensible. And I think most of the stuff that organizations are doing right now doesn't pass the common sense test. If you're being told you've got to be in the office 3 days a week, but when you go in, your colleagues aren't in the same days as you, or, you can't actually find anywhere to do video calls because all the meeting rooms are booked. If it doesn't pass the common sense test, then most definitely when employees are thinking about, should I go and work somewhere else? Should I go and work somewhere that's got a slightly more relaxed policy? It's going to be one of the things that propels them in that direction.
You were talking about social interaction there and engagement, and about it being important. And I've heard you talk about that before. You're now a public speaker and an author. You're no longer based in the office. Do you miss that water cooler moment, those social engagements on a day-to-day basis?
My favorite thing in the world is just like casually spending a morning and afternoon laughing with colleagues, sort of, shooting the breeze, having a laugh with colleagues, finding things funny. My favorite thing in the world, and actually like the moment I stopped doing that and became a full-time writer was when the pandemic came. So I've missed it hugely, but thankfully I feel like everyone was in the same boat as me, really.
You're talking about being a writer now. My last question for you is, you have an upcoming book by the name of Fortitude. Can you just give us a little glimpse into what that book is about?
The book is about how resilience is a myth that's peddled to us. Resilience is a convenient product that's sold to companies, that's sold to organizations to solve the fact that they do have burnout, they have workers who are exhausted. And resilience is this thing where we're told, oh, you need to be more resilient. And look, I'm not disputing resilience exists, but the version of resilience we've been sold is like a fad diet. The idea that somehow kids can turn on a resilience switch, or that, one of the biggest audiences for resilience training is combat soldiers, or the office workers who are working, who can't get to the bottom of their inbox and they're being summoned to new meetings. The idea that the issue they've got is not that their work is toxic, but that they aren't resilient enough is a brilliant misdirection. However, So, really good evidence that we're being sold something that doesn't exist there. However, can we be strong collectively? Strong? Absolutely we can. The people of Ukraine are the most inspiring example of that. But how are they resilient? Well, probably if you asked any of them individually, do you believe you'd be able to do this? Probably they'd have said no. But now, because they achieve this collective strength, they're all in it together. They feel they've got this fortitude, they've got this resilience. And this is the fundamental mistake. The version of resilience we're sold is that it's this individual strength that any of us can access. And in fact, if you've been sent on a resilience webinar and you don't feel stronger, that's probably something wrong with you. Actually, the truth of it is resilience is all around us, but it's about feeling connected to others. It's about feeling supported and emboldened by others. So, the resilient fortitude is about trying to understand that. Now, what that would mean for companies is that if we want to make our workers stronger, we need to make them feel supported, connected, networked into each other. And it's often not what firms want to do. They just want workers to get on with it. So it's about that.
Really looking forward to reading that. Do we know when that's set for release, Bruce?
It's out in August. I'm going to be doing some offers, pre-release offers. I'm giving away a workplace culture course for anyone who pre-orders it. And you can find that on my website, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. That'll be coming up. The offer's coming up in 3 weeks.
Absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you for taking the time and your generosity for speaking with me today, Bruce.
My pleasure, truly.